Chapter 69. "She just like a lil doll," squealed Missy Ann, hopping ecstatically up and down, clapping her hands with delight as she saw Kizzy for the first time 3 days later in Belle's kitchen. "Can't she be mine?" Belle smiled widely with pleasure. "Well, she belongs to me and her daddy, honey, but just soon's she big enough, you sho can play wid her all you wants." And so she did. As often as not, whenever Kunta went to the kitchen now to find out if the buggy would be needed, or simply to visit Belle, he would find the Massa's flaxen-haired little niece, 4 years old now, bent over the edge of Kizzy's basket, cooing down at her. "Just pretty as you can be. We gonna have plenty fun soon's you get some size, you hear me? You just hurry up and grow, now." Kunta never said anything about it, but it galled him to think how that two-bob child acted as if Kizzy had entered the world to serve her as her plaything. Like some extraordinary doll. Belle hadn't even respected his manhood and fatherhood enough to ask his feelings about his daughter playing with the daughter of the man who bought him, he thought bitterly. It seemed to him sometimes that Belle was less concerned about his feelings than she was about the Massa's. He'd lost count of the evenings she'd spent talking about what a blessing it was that little Missy Ann had come along to replace Massa Waller's real daughter, who had died at birth along with her mother. "Oh, Lawd, I just even hates to think back on it," she told him, sniffing one night. "Po' little pretty Mrs. Priscilla weren't hardly no bigger'n a bird, walkin' round here every day singin' to herself and smilin' at me and pattin' herself, just waitin' for her baby's time. And then that mornin', just a-screamin' and finally dyin'. Her and the little baby gal, too. Look like I ain't hardly seen po' Massa do no smilin' since, leastways not till dis here little Missy Ann." Kunta felt no pity for the Massa's loneliness, but it seemed to him that getting married again would keep the Massa too busy to spend so much time doting on his niece. In that way would almost certainly cut down on Missy Ann's visits to the plantation, and therefore to play with Kizzy. "Ever since then I been watchin' how Massa get dat lil gal in his lap, hold her close, talk to her, sing her to sleep, and then just set on dere holdin' her ruther'n put her to bed. Just act like he don't ever want his eyes to leave her all the time she been round here. And I know it's 'cause he's her daddy in his heart." It could only dispose the Massa even more kindly toward both of them, not to mention toward Kizzy, Belle would tell him, for Missy Ann to strike up a friendship that would bring her over to the Massa's house even more often than before. Nor could it hurt Massa John and his sickly wife. She reasoned slyly that their daughter was developing a special closeness to her uncle, 'cause den the closer they figures they is to Massa's money, however important the Massa's brother acted. She said she knew for a fact that he borrowed from the Massa now and then, and Kunta knew enough not to disbelieve her. Not that he really cared which two-bob was richer than which, since they were all alike to him. Oftentimes now, since Kizzy's arrival, as Kunta drove the Massa around to see his patients and his friends, he would find himself sharing the wish Belle had often expressed that the Massa would marry again, although Kunta's reasons were entirely different from Belle's. "He'd just be so pitiful to me livin' all by hisself in his big house. Fact, I believes dat's how come he keep y'all always out there in de buggy on dem roads. He just want to keep hisself movin', ruther'n settin' round here by hisself, Lawd. Even little ol' Missy Ann sees it. Last time she was here, I was servin' them lunch, and all of a sudden she say, 'Uncle William, how come you ain't got no wife like everybody else?' And po' thing, he didn't know what to say to her." Though he had never told Belle about it because he knew how much she loved prying into two-bob affairs, Kunta knew of several women who would run almost on their tiptoes out to meet the Massa's buggy whenever Kunta turned into their driveway. The fat black cook of one of Massa's more incurable patients had told Kunta scornfully, "Dat hateful huzzy ain't got nothin' wrong dat catchin' yo' Massa wouldn't cure mighty fast. She done already drive one man to the grave with her ornery evil ways, and now she just claimin' sickness to keep yo' massa comin' back here. I sure wish he could see her soon's y'all leave, a hollerin' and carryin' on at us like we was mules or somethin', and she don't never touch them medicines he give her. There was another woman patient who would always come onto her front porch with the massa as he left, clinging to one of his arms as if she might fall, and looking up into his face while fluttering her fan weakly. But with both of these women the massa always acted very stiff and formal, and his visits always seemed to be shorter than with his other patients. So the months kept on rolling past, with Missy Ann being brought to visit Massa Waller about twice a week, and each time she came she'd spend hours playing with Kizzy. Though he was helpless to do anything about it, Kunta tried at least to avoid seeing them together, but they seemed to be everywhere he turned, and he couldn't escape the sight of his little girl being patted, kissed, or fondled by the Massa's niece. It filled him with revulsion, and reminded him of an African saying so old that it had come down from the forefathers: in the end, the cat always eats the mouse it played with. The only thing that made it bearable for Kunta was the days and nights in between her visits. It was summer by the time Kizzy began to crawl, and Belle and Kunta would spend the evenings in their cabin watching with delight as she scuttled about the floor with her little diapered behind upraised. But then Missy Ann would show up again and off they'd go, with the older girl frisking in circles around her shouting, "Come on, Kizzy, come on!" and Kizzy crawling in pursuit as quickly as she could, gurgling with pleasure at the game and the attention. Belle would beam with pleasure, but she'd know that even if Kunta was away driving the massa, he only needed to find out that Missy Ann had been there to return to the cabin that night with his face set and his lips compressed, and for the rest of the night he would be totally withdrawn, which Belle found extremely irritating. But when she considered what might happen if Kunta should ever exhibit his feelings even vaguely in any manner that might reach the massa, she was also a little frightened when he acted that way. So Belle tried to convince Kunta that no harm could come of the relationship if only he could bring himself to accept it. Oftentimes, she told him, white girls grew up into lifetimes of true devotion and even deep loyalties to black childhood playmates. "Fo you commenced to drive in the buggy," she said, "they was a white missus died havin' a child, just like his own missus did, only this time the baby girl lived and got suckled by a woman what just had a baby girl of her own. Them little gals had grown up near about like sisters when that massa married again. But that new missus was so strong against them gals bein' close, she finally swayed that massa to sell away the black gal and her mammy both. But the moment they were gone," she went on, "the white girl went into such continuing hysterics that time and again Massa Waller was sent for, until finally he told the father that further weakness and grief would kill his daughter unless the black girl was returned. Dat massa was 'bout ready to whip dat new wife of his'n. He left on his ridin' hoss, and ain't no tellin' how much he must have spent trackin' down de trader dat took de gal and her mammy away, and den buyin' dem back from de new massa de trader had sold 'em to. But he brought back dat gal and got a lawyer and deeded her over to be de property o' his own gal." And Belle said that even now, years later, though that white girl had grown to womanhood, she had never entirely regained her health. The black one's still livin' right wid her and takin' care of her, and neither one ain't never even married. As far as Kunta was concerned, if Belle had intended her story as an argument against friendship between black and whites rather than in favor of it, she could hardly have made a more eloquent case. Chapter 70. From about the time Kizzy had been born, both Kunta and the fiddler had returned to the plantation now and then with news about some island across the big water called Haiti, where it was said that around 36,000 mostly French whites were outnumbered by about 500,000 blacks who had been brought there on ships from Africa to slave on huge plantations growing sugarcane, coffee, indigo, and cocoa. One night Belle said she had heard Massa Waller telling his dinner guests that reportedly Haiti's rich class of whites lived like kings, while snubbing the many poorer whites who couldn't afford slaves of their own. "'Magine that! Who ever heard of such a thing?" said the fiddler sarcastically. "Hush!" said Belle, laughing, and went on to say that the Massa then told his horrified guests that for several generations in Haiti so much breeding had gone on between white men and slave women that there were now almost 28,000 mixed people and high yallers, commonly called colored people, of whom nearly all had been given freedom by their French owners and fathers. According to one of the other guests, said Belle, these colored people invariably sought yet lighter complexioned mates, with their goal being children of entirely white appearance, and those who remained visibly mixed would bribe officials for documents declaring that their forefathers had been Indians or Spanish or anything but Africans. As astonishing as he found it to believe, and as deeply as he deplored it, Massa Waller had said that through the gift deeds, or the last wills of many whites, quite a sizable number of these coloreds had come to own at least 1/5 of all the Haitian land, and its slaves, that they vacationed in France and schooled their children there just as the rich whites did, and even snubbed poor whites. Belle's audience was as delighted to hear that as the masses had been scandalized. "You gon' laugh out the other side's yo' mouth," the fiddler interrupted, "when you hears what I heard some o' dem rich masses talkin' 'bout at one o' dem society cotilliums I played at a while back. The masses," he said, "were nodding their heads as they discussed how those poor whites down in Haiti hated those mixed people and high yallers so much that they'd signed petitions until France finally passed laws prohibiting, quote, coloreds from walking about at night, from sitting alongside whites in churches, or even from wearing the same kind of fabrics in their clothes. In the meantime," said the fiddler, "both whites and, quote, coloreds would take out their bitterness toward each other on Haiti's 500,000 black slaves." Kunta said he had overheard talk in town among laughing whites that made it sound as if Haitian slaves were suffering worse than here. He said he'd heard that blacks getting beaten to death or buried alive as punishment was commonplace, and that pregnant black women were often driven at work until they miscarried. Since he felt it wouldn't have served any purpose other than to terrify them, he didn't tell them that he had heard about even more inhuman bestialities, such as a black man's hands being nailed to a wall until he was forced to eat his own cut-off ears, a Tubob woman having all her slaves' tongues cut out, another gagging a black child's mouth until he starved. In the wake of such horror stories over the past 9 or 10 months, it didn't surprise Kunta, on one of his trips to town during the summer of 1791, to learn that Haiti's black slaves had risen in a wild, bloody revolt. Thousands of them had swept forth slaughtering, clubbing, and beheading white men, gutting children, raping women, and burning every plantation building until northern Haiti lay in smoking ruins, and the terrorized escaped white population was fighting to stay alive and lashing back, torturing, killing, even skinning every black they could catch. But they had been only a handful of survivors, steadily dwindling before the wildly spreading black revolt, until by the end of August the few remaining thousands of whites still alive were in hiding places or trying to flee the island. Kunta said he had never seen Spotsylvania County's Tubob so angry and afraid. "Seems like dey's even scareder than the last uprising right here in Virginia," said the fiddler. "Was maybe 2-3 years after you come, but you still weren't hardly talking to nobody, so don't reckon you even knowed it. Was right over yonder in New Wales, in Hanover County, during one Christmas time. A overseer beat some young to the ground, and dat sprung up and went at him with a axe, but he missed him, and the other jumped the overseer and beat him so bad that the first come and saved his life. That overseer went running for help, all bloody, and meanwhile dem mad caught 2 more white mens and tied 'em up and was beatin' on 'em when a great big bunch of whites come a-runnin' with guns. Dem took cover in a barn, and the white folks tried to sweet-talk 'em to come out, but dem come a-rushin' with barrel staves and clubs, and it wound up with 2 shot dead, and a lot of both white men's and hurt. They put out militia patrols, and some mo' laws was passed, and sich as that, till it simmered down. Dis here Haiti thing done freshened white folks' minds, 'cause they knows just good as me it's a whole heap of right under dey noses wouldn't need nothin' but the right spark to rise up right now, and once that ever get to spreadin', yes suh, it be the same as Haiti right here in Virginia. The fiddler clearly relished the thought. Quinta was soon to see the whites fight for himself wherever he drove in the towns or near the crossroads stores, taverns, church, meeting houses, or wherever else they gathered in small agitated clusters, their faces red and scowling whenever he or any other black passed nearby. Even the massa, who rarely spoke to Quinta other than to tell him where he wanted to be driven, made even those words noticeably colder and more clipped. Within a week, the Spotsylvania County militia was patrolling the roads, demanding to know the destination and to inspect the traveling permit of any passing blacks, and beating and jailing any they thought acted or even looked suspicious. At a meeting of the area's masses, the soon approaching big annual harvest frolic for slaves was canceled, along with all other black gatherings beyond home plantations, and even any home slave row dancing or prayer meetings were to be watched by an overseer or some other white. When Massa told me that, I told him me and Aunt Suki and Sister Mandy gets on our knees and prays to Jesus together every Sunday and any other chance we gets. But he ain't say nothin' 'bout watchin' us, so we gon' keep right on prayin', Belle told the others on Slave Row. Alone at home with Quinta and Kizzy for the next several nights in search of the latest news, Belle spelled her way through several newspapers the massa thought he had discarded. It took her the better part of an hour on one big story before she could tell him that some kind o' Bill o' Rights done got. Belle hesitated and drew a deep breath. Well, it done got ratified or something 'nother. But there were far more reports about recent events in Haiti, most of which they'd already heard through the slave grapevine. The gist of most of them, she said, was that the Haitian slave revolt could easily spread foolhardy notions among black malcontents in this country, that extreme restrictions and harsh punishments should be imposed. As she folded up the papers and put them away, Belle said, "Look like to me ain't much more they can do 'gainst us. Less'n it's just chains us all up, I reckon." Over the next month or two, however, news of further developments in Haiti slowly ebbed, and with it came a gradual easing of tensions and a lightening of restrictions throughout the South. The harvest season had begun, and whites were congratulating one another on the bumper cotton crop, and the record prices they were getting for it. The fiddler was being sent for to play at so many big house balls and parties that during the daytime when he was back home he did little more than sleep. "Look like them masses making so much cotton money, they just gonna dance theyselves to death," he told Quinta. It wasn't long, however, until the white folks had something to be unhappy about again. On his visits to the county seat with the massa, Quinta began to hear angry talk of increasing numbers of anti-slavery societies organized by traitors to the white race, not only in the North but also in the South. Highly dubious, he told Belle what he had heard, and she said she'd been reading the same thing in the masses' newspapers, which attributed their recent and rapid growth to Haiti's black revolt. "Keeps tryin' tell you it's some good white folks," she exclaimed. "Fact of the matter, I's heard a whole heap of 'em was 'gainst the first ships ever bringin' any y'all African here." Quinta wondered where on earth Belle thought her own grandparents had come from, but she was so wound up that he let it pass. "'Cause any time something like dat bees in de paper," she went on, "de masses gets riled up, rantin' and hollerin' 'bout enemies of de country and sich as that. But what's 'portant is de mo' white folks 'gainst slavery says what they thinks. Den de mo' of 'em masses get to wonderin' in dey secret heart is dey right or not." She stared at Quinta. "'Specially dem callin' deyselves Christians." She looked at him again, a slyness in her eyes. "What you think me and Aunt Sukie and Sister Mandy be's talkin' 'bout these Sundays, massa think we just singin' and prayin'. I follows white folks close. Take them Quakers. They was 'gainst slavin' even 'fo dat revolution. I means right here in Virginia," she went on. "And plenty o' dem was masses ownin' a heap o'. But den preachers commenced to sayin' was human beings, with rights to be free like anybody else, and you 'members some Quaker masses startin' to lettin' dey loose, and even helpin' 'em get up north. By now it done got to where de Quakers dat's still keepin' dey is bein' talked 'bout by de rest, and I's heerd if they still don't let them go, dey gonna get disowned by dey church. Goin' on right today, sho is," Belle exclaimed. "And dem Methodists is de next bes'. I 'members readin' 11 years back, Methodists called a great big meetin' in Baltimore, and finally dey 'greed slaves was 'gainst God's laws, and that anybody callin' hisself Christian wouldn't have it did to deyselves. So it's mostly the Methodists and Quakers makin' church fuss to get laws to free dem Baptist and Presbyterian white folks. Dat's what Massa and all the Wallers is. Well, dey seems like to me just half-hearted. Dey's mostly worried 'bout dey own freedom to worship like dey pleases, and den how dey can keep a clear conscience, and dey bofe." For all of Belle's talk of whites who were against slavery, even though she had read some of it in the Massa's own newspaper, Quinta had never once heard a two-bob opinion expressed that was not absolutely the opposite. And during that spring and summer of 1792, the Massa shared his buggy with some of the biggest and richest Massas, politicians, lawyers, and merchants in the state. Unless something else was more pressing, their ever-ready topic of conversation was the problems created for them by blacks. Whoever would successfully manage slaves, someone would always say, must first understand that their African pasts of living in jungles with animals gave them a natural inheritance of stupidity, laziness, and unclean habits, and that the Christian duty of those God had blessed with superiority was to teach these creatures some sense of discipline, morality, and respect for work, through example, of course, but also with laws and punishment as needed. Although encouragement and rewards should certainly be given to those who proved deserving. Any laxity on the part of whites, the conversation always continued, would simply invite the kind of dishonesty, tricks, and cunning that came naturally to a lower species, and the bleedings of anti-slavery societies and others like them could come only from those, particularly in the North, who had never owned any black ones themselves or tried to run a plantation with them. Such people couldn't be expected to realize how one's impatience, heart, spirit, and very soul could be strained to the breaking point by the trials and burdens of owning slaves. Quinta had been listening to the same outrageous nonsense for so long that it had become like a litany to him, and he hardly paid any attention to it any more. But sometimes, while he drove along, he couldn't help asking himself why it was that his countrymen didn't simply kill every two-bob who set foot on African soil. He was never able to give himself an answer that he was able to accept. Chapter 71. It was about the noon hour on a sultry day late in August when Aunt Suki came waddling as fast as she could out to the fiddler among his tomato plants and, between gasps, told him that she was worried to death about the old gardener. When he didn't come to her cabin for breakfast, she hadn't thought anything about it, she said breathlessly. But when he didn't appear for lunch either, she became concerned, went to his cabin door, knocked, and called as loudly as she could, but got no answer, became alarmed, and thought she'd better come to find out if the fiddler had seen him anywhere. He hadn't. "Knowed it somehow or another even 'fore I went in there," the fiddler told Kunta that night. And Kunta said that he had been unable to explain an eerie feeling he had himself as he had driven the massa homeward that afternoon. "He was just lying there in bed real peaceful like," said the fiddler, "wid a little smile on his face. Looked like he's sleepin', but Aunt Suki said he already waked up in Heb'em. He said he had gone to take the sad news out to those working in the fields, and the boss field hand Cato returned with him to help wash the body and place it on a cooling board. Then they had hung the old gardener's sweat-browned straw hat on the outside of his door in the traditional sign of mourning before the field workers returned and gathered in front of the cabin to pay their last respects, and then Cato and another field hand went to dig a grave." Kunta returned to his cabin feeling doubly grieved, not only because the gardener was dead, but because he hadn't been visiting him as much as he could have ever since Kizzy was born. It had just seemed that there was hardly ever enough time any more, and now it was too late. He arrived to find Belle in tears, which he expected, but he was taken aback at the reason she gave for crying. "Just always seemed like to me he was the daddy I ain't never seed," she sobbed. "Don't know how come I didn't never let him know. But it ain't goin' never seem the same without him bein' round here." She and Kunta ate their supper in silence before taking Kizzy with them, bundled against the cool autumn night, to join the others settin' with the dead, until late into the night. Kunta sat a little apart from the others, with the restless Kizzy on his lap during the first hour of prayers and soft singing, and then some hushed conversation was begun by Sister Mandy, asking if anyone there could recall the old man ever having mentioned any living relatives. The fiddler said, "One time way back I 'members he said he never knowed his mammy. That's all I ever heard him say of family." Since the fiddler had been the closest among them to the old man, and he would know if anyone did, it was decided that there was probably no one to whom word should be sent. Another prayer was said, another song was sung, then Aunt Suki said, "Seem like he done always belonged to some of the Wallers. I's heard him talk about de massa riding on his shoulders as a boy, so I reckon that's why massa bring him here later on when he got his own big house. Massa real sorry too," said Belle. "He say for me to tell y'all won't be no workin' for half a day tomorrow." "Well, least he gonna get buried right," said Ada, the field hand mother of the boy Noah, who sat impassively beside her. "It's a plenty o' masses just 'lows you to quit workin' long enough to come look at the dead 'fore he gets stuck in the ground still warm. Well, all these Wallers is quality white folks, so wouldn't none us here have to worry about dat," said Belle. Others started talking then about how rich plantation owners sometimes staged very elaborate funerals for usually either long-time big house cooks or for the old mammies who had suckled and helped to raise 2 or even 3 broods of families' children. "They even gets buried in the white folks' graveyard, with flat rocks to mark where they is. What a heartwarming, if somewhat belated, reward for a lifetime of toil," thought Kunta bitterly. He remembered the gardener telling him that he had come to the Mass's big house as a strong young stable hand, which he had remained for many years until he was kicked badly by a horse. He stayed on the job, but gradually he had become more and more disabled, and finally Massa Waller had told him to spend his remaining years doing whatever he felt able to do. With Kunta as his assistant, he had tended the vegetable garden until he was too feeble to do even that, and from then on had spent most of his time weaving corn shucks into hats and straw into chair bottoms and fans, until advancing arthritis had crippled even his fingers. Kunta recalled another old man he had seen now and then at a rich big house across the county. Though he had long since been allowed to retire, he demanded every morning that some younger blacks carry him out to the garden, where he would lie on his side plucking weeds with gnarled hands among the flower beds of his equally old and crippled beloved lifetime missus. And these were the lucky ones, Kunta knew. Many old folks began to get beaten when they were no longer able to perform their previous quota of work, and finally they got sold away for perhaps $20 or $30 to some po' white trash farmer with aspirations of rising into the planter class, who worked them literally to death. Kunta was snapped out of those thoughts as everyone rose from their seats all around him, said a final prayer, and headed wearily for a few hours of sleep that were left before daybreak. Right after breakfast, the fiddler dressed the old man in the worn dark suit the old man had been given many years before by Massa Waller's daddy. His few other clothes had been burned, since whoever might wear a dead person's clothes would soon die too, Bell told Kunta. Then Cato tied the body on a wide board that he had shaped to a point at both ends with an axe. A little while later, Massa Waller came out of the big house carrying his big black Bible and fell in behind the Slave Row people as they walked with a peculiar pausing, hitching step behind the body being drawn on a mule cart. They were softly chanting a song Kunta had never heard before. In de morning, when I gets there, gonna tell my Jesus Heidi Heidi. In de morning, gonna to rise up, tell my Jesus Heidi Heidi. They kept on singing all the way to the slave graveyard, which Kunta had noticed everyone avoided in a deep fear of what they called ghosts and haunts, which he felt must bear some resemblance to his Africa's evil spirits. His people also avoided the burial ground, but out of consideration for the dead whom they didn't wish to disturb, rather than out of fear. When Massa Waller stopped on one side of the grave, his slaves on the other, old Aunt Suki began to pray. Then a young field hand woman named Pearl sang a sad song. Hurry home, my weary soul, I heard from Hebem today. Hurry long, my weary soul, my sins forgived, and my soul's set free. And then Massa Waller spoke with his head bowed. Josephus, you have been a good and faithful servant. May God rest and bless your soul. Amen. Through his sorrow, Kunta was surprised to hear that the old gardener had been called Josephus. He wondered what the gardener's true name had been, the name of his African forefathers, and to what tribe they had belonged. He wondered if the gardener himself had known. More likely he had died as he had lived, without ever learning who he really was. Through misted eyes, Kunta and the others watched as Cato and his helper lowered the old man into the earth he had spent so many years making things grow in. When the shovelfuls of dirt began to thud down onto his face and chest, Kunta gulped and blinked back the tears as the women around him began to weep, and the men to clear their throats and blow their noses. As they trudged silently back from the graveyard, Kunta thought how the family and close friends of one who had died in Jafur would wail and roll in ashes and dust within their huts, while the other villagers danced outside, for most African people believed that there could be no sorrow without happiness, no death without life, in that cycle that his own father had explained to him when his beloved Grandma Yesa had died. He remembered that Omoro had told him, "Stop weeping now, Kunta," and explained that Grandma had only joined another of the three peoples in every village, those who had gone to be with Allah, those who were still living, and those who were yet to be born. For a moment, Kunta thought he must try to explain that to Belle, but he knew she wouldn't understand. His heart sank until he decided a moment later that this would become another of the many things he would one day tell Kizzy about the homeland she would never see. Chapter 72. The death of the gardener continued to weigh so heavily on Kunta's mind that Belle finally said something about it one evening after Kizzy went to bed. "Look-a-here, Kunta, I knows how you felt about that gardener, but ain't it about time you snap out of it and join the living?" He just glared at her. "Suit yourself, but ain't gonna be much of a second birthday for Kizzy next Sunday with you moping round like this." "I be fine," said Kunta stiffly, hoping Belle couldn't tell that he'd forgotten all about it. He had 5 days to make Kizzy a present. By Thursday afternoon he had carved a beautiful Mandinka doll out of pine wood, rubbed it with linseed oil and lampblack, then polished it until it shone like the ebony carvings of his homeland. And Belle, who had long since finished making her a dress, was in the kitchen, dipping 2 tiny pink candles to put on the chocolate cake Aunt Suki and Sister Mandy were going to help them eat on Sunday evening, when Massa John's driver Roosby arrived in the buggy. Belle had to bite her tongue when the Massa, beaming, called her in to announce that Missy Ann had persuaded her parents to let her spend an entire weekend with her uncle. She'd be arriving tomorrow evening. "Make sure you have a guest room ready," said the Massa. "And why don't you bake a cake or something for Sunday? My niece tells me your little girl is celebrating a birthday, and she'd like to have a party, just the 2 of them, up in her room. Anne also asked if she could spend the night with her up there in the house, and I said that it would be all right, so be sure to prepare a pallet for the floor at the foot of the bed." When Belle broke the news to Kunta, adding that the cake she was going to make would have to be served in the big house instead of their cabin, and that Kizzy was going to be so busy partying with Missy Ann that they wouldn't be able to have a party of their own, Kunta was so angry that he couldn't speak or even look at her. Stomping outside, he went straight to the barn, where he'd hidden the doll under a pile of straw and pulled it out. He had vowed to Allah that this kind of thing would never happen to his Kizzy, but what could he do? He felt such a sickening sense of frustration that he could almost begin to understand why these blacks finally came to believe that resisting the 2-bob was as useless as a flower trying to keep its head above the falling snow. But then, staring at the doll, he thought of the black mother he'd heard about who had bashed out her infant's brains against the auction block, screaming, "Ain't gon' do to her what you done to me," and he raised the doll over his head to dash it against the wall, then lowered it. No, he could never do that to her. But what about escape? Belle herself had mentioned it once. Would she really go? And if she would, could they ever make it, at their age, with his half-foot, with a child barely old enough to walk? He hadn't seriously considered the idea for many years, but he did know the region by now as well as he did the plantation itself. Maybe. Dropping the doll, he got up and walked back to the cabin, but Belle started talking before he got the chance to. "Kunta, I feels the same as you, but listen to me. I ruther dis than her growing up a field-hand youngin' like that little old Noah. He ain't but 2 years older'n Kizzy, and already they done startin' taking him out there to pullin' weeds and tottin' water. Don't care how else you feels. Seem like you got to agree with that." As usual, Kunta said nothing, but he had seen and done enough during his quarter-century years as a slave to know that the life of a field hand was the life of a farm animal, and he would rather die than be responsible for sentencing his daughter to such a fate. Then one evening a few weeks later he arrived home to find Belle waiting at the door with the cup of cold milk he always looked forward to after a long drive. When he sat down in his rocking chair to wait for supper, she came up behind him and, without even being asked, rubbed his back in just the spot where she knew it always hurt after a day at the reins. When she set a plate of his favorite African stew in front of him, he knew she must be trying to soften him up for something, but he knew enough not to ask her what. All the way through supper she chattered even more than usual about things that mattered even less than usual, and he was beginning to wonder if she'd ever get around to it when, about an hour after supper, as they were getting ready to go to bed, she stopped talking for a long moment, took a deep breath, and put her hand on his arm. He knew this was it. Kunta, I don't know how to tell you this, so I'll just spit it out. Massa done told me he promised Missy Ann to drop Kizzy off at Massa John's to spend the day with her when he passed by there on his rounds tomorrow. This was too much. It was outrageous enough to have to sit by and watch while Kizzy was turned slowly into a well-mannered lapdog. But now that she'd been housebroken, they wanted him to deliver the animal to its new keeper. Kunta shut his eyes, struggling to contain his rage, then leaped up from his chair, pulling his arm viciously away from Belle, and bolted out the door. While she lay sleepless in their bed that night, he sat sleepless in the stable beneath his harnesses. Both of them were weeping. When they pulled up in front of Massa John's house the next morning, Missy Ann ran out to meet them before Kunta even had the chance to lift Kizzy to the ground. She didn't even say goodbye, he thought bitterly, hearing behind them the pealings of girlish laughter as he swerved the horses back down the driveway toward the main road. It was late afternoon, and he had been waiting several hours for the Massa outside a big house about 20 miles down the road, when a slave came out and told him that Massa Waller might have to sit up all night with their sick Missy, and for Kunta to come back for him the next day. Morosely, Kunta obeyed, arriving to find that Missy Ann had begged her sickly mother to let Kizzy stay overnight. Deeply relieved when the reply came that their noise had given her a headache, Kunta was soon rolling back homeward again with Kizzy, holding on and bouncing beside him on the narrow driver's seat. As they rode along, it dawned on Kunta that this was the first time he had been absolutely alone with her since the night he had told her what her name was. He felt a strange and mounting exhilaration as they drove on into the gathering dusk, but he also felt rather foolish. As much thought as he had given to his plans for and his responsibilities to this firstborn, he found himself uncertain how to act. Abruptly he lifted Kizzy up onto his lap. Awkwardly he felt her arms, her legs, her head, as she squirmed and stared at him curiously. He lifted her again, testing how much she weighed. Then, very gravely, he placed the reins within her warm, small palms, and soon Kizzy's happy laughter seemed the most delightful sound he had ever heard. "You pretty little gal," he said to her finally. She just looked at him. "You look just like my little brother Maddie." She just kept looking at him. "Fa," he said, pointing to himself. She looked at his finger. Tapping his chest, he repeated, "Fa." But she had turned her attention back to the horses. Flicking the reins, she squealed, "Get up," imitating something else she'd heard him say. She smiled proudly up at him, but he looked so hurt that it faded quickly, and they rode on the rest of the way in silence. It was weeks later, while they were riding home from a second visit with Missy Ann, that Kizzy leaned over toward Kunta, stuck her chubby little finger against his chest, and with a twinkle in her eye said, "Fa." He was thrilled. "Ito mu Kizzy la," he said, taking her finger and pointing it back at her. "Yo name Kizzy." He paused. "Kizzy." She began to smile, recognizing her own name. He pointed toward himself, Kunta Kinti. But Kizzy seemed perplexed. She pointed at him. "Fa." This time they both smiled wide. By midsummer, Kunta was delighted with how fast Kizzy was learning the words he was teaching her, and how much she seemed to be enjoying their rides together. He began to think there might be hope for her yet. Then one day she happened to repeat a word or two of Mandinka when she was alone with Belle, who later had sent Kizzy over to Aunt Suki's for supper and was waiting for Kunta when he got home that night. "Ain't you got no sense at all, man?" she shouted. "Don't you know you better pay me 'tention? Get that child and all us in bad trouble with that mess. You better get in your hard head she ain't no African." Kunta never had come so close to striking Belle. Not only had she committed the unthinkable offense of raising her voice to her husband, but even worse, she had disowned his blood and his seed. Could not one breathe a word of one's true heritage without fearing punishment from some two-bob? Yet something warned him not to vent the wrath he felt, for any head-on collision with Belle might somehow end his buggy trips with Kizzy. But then he thought she couldn't do that without telling the massa why, and she would never dare to tell. Even so, he couldn't comprehend what had ever possessed him to marry any woman born in Two-Bob Land. While he was waiting for the massa to finish a house call at a nearby plantation the next day, another buggy driver told Kunta the latest story he'd heard about Toussaint, a former slave who had organized a large army of black rebels in Haiti and was leading them successfully against not only the French, but also the Spanish and the English. Toussaint, the driver said, had learned about war from reading books about famous ancient fighters named Alexander the Great and Julius Caesar, and that these books had been given to him by his former massa, who he later helped escape from Haiti to the United States. Over the past few months, Toussaint had become for Kunta a hero, ranking second in stature only to the legendary Mandinka warrior Sundiata, and Kunta could hardly wait to get back home and pass this fascinating story along to the others. He forgot to tell them. Belle met him at the stable with the news that Kizzy had come down with a fever and broken out in bumps. The massa called it mumps, and Kunta was worried until Belle told him it was only normal in young'uns. When he learned later that Missy Ann had been ordered to stay away until Kizzy recovered, for at least 2 weeks, he was even a little bit happy about it. But Kizzy had been sick only a few days when Massa John's driver Roosby showed up with a fully dressed Two-Bob doll for Missy Ann. Kizzy fell in love with it. She sat in bed hugging the doll close, rocking it back and forth, exclaiming with her eyes half shut, "Just so pretty." Kunta left without a word and stormed across the yard to the barn. The doll was still in the loft where he'd dropped it and forgotten it months before. Wiping it on his sleeve, he carried it back to the cabin and almost shoved it at Kizzy. She laughed with pleasure when she saw it, and even Belle admired it. But Kunta could see, after a few minutes, that Kizzy liked the Two-Bob doll better, and for the first time in his life he was furious with his daughter. It didn't make him any happier to notice how eagerly the two girls made up for the weeks of being together they had missed. Although sometimes Kunta was told to take Kizzy to play at Missy Ann's house, it was no secret that Missy Ann preferred to visit at her uncle's, since her mother was quick to complain of headaches because of the noise they made, and would even resort to fainting spells as a final weapon, according to their cook, Omega. But she said ol' Missy had her match in her quick-tongued daughter. Roosby told Belle one day that his missus had yelled at the girls, "You're actin' just like—" And Missy Ann had shot back, "Well, has more fun than us, 'cause they ain't got nothin' to worry about." But the two girls made all the noise they pleased at Massa Waller's. Kunta seldom drove the buggy either way along the flowered drive without hearing the girls shrieking somewhere as they romped in the house, the yards, the garden, and, despite Belle's best efforts to prevent it, even in the chicken coops, the hog pen, and the barn, as well as the unlocked slave row cabins. One afternoon, while Kunta was off with the massa, Kizzy took Missy Ann into her cabin to show her Kunta's gourd of pebbles, which she had discovered and become fascinated with while she was home with the mumps. Belle, who happened to walk in just as Kizzy was reaching into the mouth of the gourd, took one look and yelled, "Get way from yo' daddy's rocks. Dey's how he tell how ol' he is." The next day Roosby arrived with the letter for the massa from his brother, and 5 minutes later Massa Waller called Belle into the drawing room, the sharpness of his tone frightening her before she left the kitchen. "Missy Ann told her parents about something she saw in your cabin. What is this African voodoo about rocks being put into a gourd every full moon?" he demanded. Her mind racing, Belle blurted, "Rocks? Rocks, massa? You know very well what I mean," said the massa. Belle forced a nervous giggle. "Oh, I knows what you's talking about. Nossa, massa ain't no voodoo. Ol' African I got just can't count, that's all, massa. So every new moon he drop a little rock into the gourd so all dem rocks say how ol' he is." Massa Waller, still frowning, gestured for Belle to return to the kitchen. 10 minutes later she charged into the cabin, snatched Kizzy from Kunta's lap, and laid into her rear end with an open hand, almost screaming. "Don't you never bring that gal in here no mo'. I'll wring yo' neck, you hear me?" After sending the weeping Kizzy fleeing to bed, Belle managed to calm herself enough to explain to Kunta. "I knows them Gordon rocks ain't no harm," she said, "but it just go to show you what I told you about them African things brings troubles, and massa don't never forget nothin'." Kunta felt such an impotent fury that he couldn't eat supper. After driving the massa nearly every day for over 20 rains, Kunta was amazed and enraged that it could still be a matter of suspicion that he simply recorded his age by dropping stones into a gourd. It was another 2 weeks before the tension subsided enough for Missy Ann's visits to resume, but once they did, it was as if the incident had never happened. Kunta was almost sorry. With the berry season in full bloom, the girls ranged up and down the vine-covered fence rows, finding the dark green wild strawberry patches and coming home with full pails, their hands and mouths tinted crimson. Other days they would return with such treasures as snail shells, a wren's nest, or a crusted old arrowhead, all of which they would exhibit gleefully to Belle before hiding them somewhere with great secrecy, wherever they might make mud pies. By the mid-afternoons, after trooping into the kitchen covered to the elbows with mud pie batter and being ordered straight outside again to wash up at the well, the joyfully exhausted pair would eat snacks that Belle had ready for them, and then lie down together on a quilt pallet for a nap. If Missy Ann was staying overnight, after her supper with the massa, she would keep him company until her bedtime, when he would send her out to tell Belle that it was time for her story, and Belle would bring in an equally worn-out Kizzy, and tell them both about the further adventures of Brer Rabbit getting tricked by Brer Fox, who finally got tricked himself. Kunta resented this deepening intimacy between the two girls even more intensely than when he saw it coming in Kizzy's crib. Part of him, he had to admit, was pleased that Kizzy was enjoying her girlhood so much, and he had come to agree with Belle that even being a Toobob's pet was better than having to spend her life in the fields. But he was sure that every now and then he could sense even in Belle a certain uneasiness when she was watching the girls romping and playing so closely together. He would dare to think that at least some of those times Belle must have felt and feared the same things he did. Some nights in their cabin, as he watched her caressing Kizzy in her lap and humming one of her Jesus songs, he would have the feeling, as she looked down at the sleepy face, that she was afraid for her, that she wanted to warn her child about caring too much for any Toobob, no matter how mutual the affection seemed. Kizzy was too young to understand such things, but Belle knew all too well what wrenching anguish could result from trusting Toobob. Had they not sold her away from her first 2 babies? There was no way even to guess at what might lie ahead for Kizzy, but also for him and Belle. But he knew one thing: Allah would wreak terrible vengeance on any Toobob who ever harmed their Kizzy.